Hey there, welcome back to Coding with NJ. Today we are diving into a web development magic trick. Ever wondered how websites make text elegantly appear as you land on their pages? Today we are creating that text animation on page load. Don't worry if you are new. We will break it down step by step for both beginners and seasoned developers. We will explore the intersection observer API and use it to craft this beautiful text animation on page load. This technique is a game changer for user experiences on websites, be it a blog, e-commerce website or anything else. So are you ready to dive in and learn how to bring your websites to life with this elegant text animation on page load? Let's start. Okay, so in order to save time and focus on our goal straight away, I have already laid out some basic foundation. For example, I have created this index.html which contains some contents I'm going to explain to you in a bit. And since most of the magic is going to happen in our JavaScript, so I have kept this empty so that we can do it together. And for the styling, I have defined all the styles that are not directly related to animation aspect of the text. Okay, so let's go to our index.html and see what it contains. So if you notice over here, first of all in the body it contains a navigation element which contains our menu items, page 1, page 2 and page 3. So these are all incorporated through unordered list. So this is the navigation part. Next we have all the contents in the main element. So main is a HTML element and the rest of the contents are defined within this main element. And within this main element we have 3 divs, and structure wise all of these 3 divs have same structure, only I have given it different class names. For example, this first div has a class name container and ID container1. The second div has a class name container2 and ID container2 as well. Third div have a class name container3 and ID container3 as well. Then each of these container divs contain a single child which is another div with the class name content. First container div has a child with the class name content. The second container div also have a child div with the class name content, and the third container div also have a child div with the class name content. And each of these content divs have one h1 element and one paragraph. However, the class names are different. For example, the h1 and p1 have been given class names heading 3 and p3 because they reside inside the container 3. And the second h1 and p have been given class names heading 2 and p2 respectively because they reside inside the container 2. And likewise, this h1 and p elements have been given class names heading 1 and p1 because they reside inside the container. Okay, let me put one over here as well just to be consistent. Okay, so this is all the contents of our HTML. We don't have anything else. We have linked our JavaScript file to this HTML file as well. And we have also linked our style file with this index.html file as well. Now let's quickly go over these styles. So for HTML we have defined scroll behavior smooth and scroll padding top 10, margin 0 and padding 0. Then for the body, font family, and I have removed margins and paddings. This is repetition, so let me remove this. For the body we have defined font family and background color. Then for the navigation we have given it position fixed, top, left and right 0 and height is 10% of the total height of the viewport. Background color is black, and in order for the navigation to stay on the browser even when we scroll down, we have to give it some Z index. So I have given it Z index 10 so that it stays at top of all the elements and the rest of the elements can flow underneath it when we are scrolling up and down. Then in order to bring those contents in the center, we have set the display property to flex and justify content and align items to center as well. Now as far as the unordered list is concerned, again we have set its display property to flex and we have set list style to none so that we remove those dots which comes with unordered list by default. For the list item we are only giving it left and right margin which is 1 rem. Top and bottom margins are 0 because those are going to be given to them because of the display flex property of its parent. Then for an anchor element which is inside the list item, so in each list item we have an anchor tag which is linking to a specific div in the page via the IDs that we have assigned to those divs. For example, the first div has the ID container1, the second div has ID container2 and third div has ID container3. Okay, so we are removing the decoration, that is the underline which comes with anchor tags, then color white, font weights, and we are capitalizing them. The first letter should be capitalized. For the main, we are setting it position absolute so that we make sure this main element comes right after our navigation div. So navigation div occupies 10% of the height of the viewport or the device. So we are saying that this main should start after that 10%. So top 10%, left and right 0. That means the width should be the 100% width and the height is 90% because the 10% has been occupied by the navigation bar. Then we are defining some basic properties for all the containers. Since I changed the name from container to container1, so I have to make the changes over here as well. So all of them have basic properties. I'm giving it some background color. I've used this color mix property. If you don't know, you can simply define color like I have defined over here. So again, I want the contents of each div to be centralized. Therefore, display flex, justify content and align item centers, and minimum height is 100%. That means whatever area is left after the navigation bar, that should be covered by the containers. Now for the container 2, I'm changing the background color, and likewise for container 3, I'm changing the background color so that each one have a different background color. And our h1s have been given class names heading 1, heading 2 and heading 3. So for the heading 1, I'm setting the text align property to center, and for the paragraph P1, which is part of container 1, again text align center. Likewise for heading 2 and P2, again only one property, text align center, and for heading 3 and P3 as well, text align is center. So these were the basic styles that we needed in order for the page to look appealing. Okay, so now this is our demo project, but now we have to open up the project on which we are working. So we are working on this project which is running on port 5501. So we have to open up this index.html but on port 5501. Okay, so this is how it currently looks, and if you notice, there is no animation. Page 1, page 2, it's a simple HTML page. Now we have to apply some animation so that it looks magical. Now in order to sprinkle that magic, we have to define certain parts in CSS and other parts through JavaScript. So first of all, let's go to our CSS. Let's see what styles we need to have to make that magic happen. Okay, so let's go to our CSS file. Now the first part was the container 1. Okay, now here's the thing. Now the first step towards achieving that magic is we have to make invisible all of those elements on which we want to apply animation. So for example, on this page we want to apply animation on both of these elements, h1 and paragraph. So the first step is to make them invisible such that when this page is loaded or when this area of the page comes into view, at that moment the state of these two elements should be invisible. So let's go and make them invisible. Let's for the time being only work on container 1. So we have heading 1 in the container 1 and P1 in the container 1 as well. So the first thing that we have to do is that we have to make them invisible. So opacity is 0. For the P1, again set the opacity to 0 as well. So this makes them invisible. Now as you can see, there is nothing there. Now in order to show you the second property, let me for the time being comment this opacity out. Now notice we have our h1 and our paragraph exactly in the center. Now the property that we are going to apply over here is transform. By transform, we are saying that we are changing this element somehow. Now there are 3 different ways of transforming a certain element. For example, we can take that element from its original place and put it somewhere else, like slide it left, right, up and down. So this is called moving away from its original position. The other transformation that we can apply is make it bigger or smaller than its original size. And the third type of translation is rotating it around certain angle such that the center of that element stays at its original position. However, its positioning has been tilted towards left or right or bottom, but its original position, that is x-axis and y-axis, remains the same. So that kind of transformation is called rotating an element. So the kind of transformation that we are interested in over here is sliding it from its original position to left, right, up and down or diagonally somewhere. So to slide it, the property is called translate. Now translate comes in 4 different types of translations. We are going to use this translate x, translate y and translate as well. So for the time being, let's use this translate x. So that means we want this element to be moved in x-axis directions. So with respect to vertical direction, it remains at its original position. However, with respect to horizontal positioning, we want it to be displaced and moved some other place. So for example, now if I give 100 pixels, so I'm saying move it from its original position, that is where by default this element is supposed to go. From that position, move it 100 pixels towards the right side. Now let's have a look. Now as you can see, this H1 has been moved 100 pixels towards the right side. So we have to do the same for this one as well. P1, copy, paste. But this time we want it to move towards the left side rather than the right side. So we have to give it -100. Now as you can see, this has been moved slightly towards the left. So this is the starting point for the animation. When this animation starts, this H1 will move towards the left and move to its original position, and this P1 will move towards the right and come to its original position. But now we have to make it disappear. So initially we have displaced them 100 pixels to left and 100 pixels to right from their original positions. So this is the first step. Now you can see it has disappeared. Now the next step is, let's define another class for both of these elements. So heading dot visible and p1 dot visible. Sorry, this is heading 1. So now we are saying when this h1 has another class as well, which is called visible, in addition to this heading 1 class, in that case we want following styles to be applied. So we want to set the opacity to 1. That means we want it to be visible, and transform and apply translation. But since we are applying horizontal translation to translate X, and put 0 because 0 is the original position. So now we are saying bring these elements back to their original positions. Okay, now let's go to the browser and see its effect. Let's open the console. Now the way we have defined the logic is that when we attach the class visible to our heading 1, then the two transitions will take place. Number 1, the opacity will change from 0 to 1, that is the text will get visible, the h1 will get visible, and second is that the text will translate back from its displaced position back to its original position. So to see its effect in action, since we haven't yet defined the JavaScript part to make it dynamic and automatic, we have to do it manually. So let's get access to that h1 element, which is given a class name heading 1. So document dot query selector, we are interested in heading 1, and to that we have to attach a class. Sorry, let me put dot because it's a class. Okay, now to that we have to attach a class to its list of currently attached classes. So class list dot add, and the class name is visible. Hit enter, and you can see the text has appeared right in the center. So that means both the transitions took place, but since they took place so instantly, we didn't see that animation effect, the text being moved from one place back to its original place. So in order to see that animation effect, we have to make sure that these two transitions take time. So in order to make them take time, we have to go back to our styles, and over here we are going to say transition. And now since we are making two transitions to take place, so the first one is opacity. We are changing opacity from 0 to 1. That means we are transitioning with respect to opacity. So we want it to take half a second to take place. Then comma, another transition that we want to take effect is the transformation that we want to take place. So transform, and this should take 1.5 seconds. Okay, now let's go back, refresh, paste it back, and hit enter. Now this time you saw that animation taking place because this time we gave certain time for this transition to take place, and as a result we were able to see this smooth transitioning effect or smooth animation effect. So basically this is all the work that we have to define in our CSS, and in the JavaScript we have to automate it such that we don't have to manually come here and write this code to make this happen. This should happen automatically. So that part will be defined in the JavaScript. But before we move on to that part, let's go back and define the rest of these styles for the remaining elements. Now since we have to define this transition, to all of these animations. So I am going to cut it from here. So rather than individually putting that line of code with all of these elements separately, we are going to go up, and over here I am creating a generic block. That means the properties that I define over here are going to be applied to all of the HTML elements, and over here I am pasting this. So this way this property is defined for all of the elements. We don't have to individually place them with all the elements for which we are interested in making them animate. Okay, now let's go. So we have already defined the properties for P1 as well. The only thing is that this heading one has positive value and this P1 has negative value. So let's just test it out in the browser, see if this P1 is working as well. So document query selector P1 class list add visible, and as you can see this P1 is also being animated, and now it's transitioning from left to right, whereas our heading was transitioning from right to left. Okay, now let's do the rest for the other two containers as well. So what we are going to do is that we are copying these two properties. Copy. Let's go down to heading 2, and over here let's paste it. Now for the second page or the second container div, we want this one to transition in y-axis. So translate y. So first one is being displaced from its original position towards the bottom. And for the P2, where is P2? There it is, P2. Let's paste this over here, and for the P2 I want it to transition in the positive direction. Let's cut it and place heading 2 and P2 together. Okay, now for the heading 2 dot visible and P2 dot visible, opacity set it to 1, and transform and translate y and bring it to its original position. Translate y. Okay, this is y. Okay, now you can see it's being transitioning from bottom towards the upward direction. Now for the heading 2, it should start at the top and descend to the bottom, but only 100 pixels. Did I do something wrong? Heading 2. Okay, so we are done with the vertical animation as well. Now let's work on the diagonal animation, which is heading 3 and P3. Again, let's copy them. Copy, paste it over here and here as well. So now we want diagonal, that means we want displacement to take place both in x-axis and y-axis direction. So therefore just translate, and we have to provide two values. The first one is for the x-axis, the second one is for y-axis. So in both positions we want 100 pixel displacement, and for the P3 again we have to do the same but with negative values. Okay, now attach visible classes. So heading 3 dot visible, comma P3 dot visible, opacity to 1, and transform translate 0, 0. P3. Now let's look for heading 3, and this is diagonally animated. Now let's check the P3 as well, and you can see both of them are being diagonally animated. Okay, so this is the part that we were supposed to do in our CSS. Now the rest is going to be defined in the JavaScript, which is basically going to make it automatic. Like over here we are manually writing the command to attach this visible class to the HTML elements. Now we want this to happen automatically whenever the respective page is brought in view in the browser, the elements on that page should get automatically attach this class visible. And when we move to the next page, the elements which are defined on this particular page should automatically get attached this visible class to them. And this will bring about the animation. And likewise for the page 3. So this is page 2. Page 2 we have to change this to page 3. Okay, so now let's go to our JavaScript. So script, first of all, we need access to all of those elements. So first one is heading 1. Let's make it h1. Document or query selector, heading 1. Copy paste, we need 6 of these. So the second one is h2, heading 2. Okay, third is heading 3. Now the rest of them are P's, P1, P2 and P3. Now the logic that we want to define is such that we want to make the browser itself responsible for figuring out which part of the web page is currently visible in the browser, and based on that make certain elements visible and the rest invisible in the browser. For example, if the div with the class name container1 is visible in the browser, that div is occupying the space in the browser. In that case, we want this heading 1 and p1 classes to be visible. And to make them visible and animate, the browser itself has to attach the class visible to these two classes, heading 1 and p1. And the moment we scroll up and now container2 occupies the browser space, in that case we want heading 1 and p1 to get invisible by removing the visible class from these two elements. And since container2 is occupying the space, so we want heading 2 and p2 to get visible. Not just visible, they should animate. And to make that happen, again the browser has to somehow attach the visible class to both of these elements, that is heading 2 and p2. And likewise, if we scroll further down and now container 3 is occupying the space in the browser, then heading 2 and paragraph 2 should get invisible again, and now heading 3 and p3 get visible and animate. So to delegate this responsibility to the browser and make that happen automatically, we have to take advantage of an API which is by default built in the browser itself. And the name of that API is called Intersection Observer API. The Intersection Observer API is capable of observing the browser or the viewport, and it can also detect which elements enter into that space or exit that space. And based on which elements have entered into that viewport space or leaving that space, it can perform certain action. But in order to make that happen, we need to create an object of type intersection observer. Then once we have created that object, we have to let it know which of the HTML elements we want this object to keep track of. So that means as a second part, we have to provide all of these elements to keep track of. And the third part is, once it starts observing these elements, we also have to define the logic that will be triggered each time any of these elements either enter this viewport area or browser space, or when any of these elements leave that viewport area. So let's start with the part 1. New intersection observer. Now to this we have to pass certain parameters, but let's ignore that part for the time being and let's move on to the part 2. That is, we have to let this observer object which elements we want it to keep track of. So to do that, we have to call observe method on this observer object. Now we have to pass in which of the elements we want the intersection observer object to keep track of. So we want h1 and we want all 6, so copy paste. Now this is h2, h3, p1, p2, p3. So this is second part. Now the third part is we have to let it know what shall happen once any of these elements enter that viewport area which is currently being displayed in the browser, or when any of these elements leave that space. So we have to provide this information through these parameters. This intersection observer constructor takes 2 parameters, the second one of which is optional, but first is mandatory, which is a callback function. And that callback function will be executed each time any of the elements which are currently being tracked change their status. That is, either they enter into the viewport area or they leave that viewport area. So in any of these cases, that callback function that we are going to provide over here is going to be triggered or executed. And whatever logic we define there, that logic in turn is going to be executed on all of the elements which are currently being executed. That means, let's suppose only one of the elements that are being tracked change their status. Either they enter the viewport area or they leave the viewport area. But the logic that we are going to define into this callback function will be executed upon all of these elements. So let's define this callback function as an arrow function. Now this arrow function takes as a parameter entries. Now these entries represent an array of all the elements which are currently being tracked by this intersection observer object. So now this callback function takes these elements as an array, and in the body of this arrow function or callback function we have to define the logic. Since now we know this entries represents an array of all the elements which are currently being tracked, we have to iterate over them. So entries.forEach. Now as we know that this for each takes another callback as a parameter, so singular entry. Now within the body of this callback function we have to check if entry dot is intersecting. So that means the element over which we are currently iterating, if that element is in the viewport area, in that case we want to target the element which is being represented through this entry. So this entry itself represents intersection observer entry object, and this object has a property which is called target. Now this target represents these elements, one of these elements, and since we are interested in one of these elements, so entry.target.classList .add visible. However, if this particular entry is leaving the viewport area or it's not in the viewport area, then we have to make sure if this visible class is attached to it, we want it to be removed from that, so that every time that particular section of the web page is made visible, the transition happens all over again. Therefore, if entry dot is intersecting, so if this entry is not currently intersecting, that is not in the viewport area, in that case we want to make sure that we are removing this visible class. So entry.target.classList.remove visible. Okay, so this is the logic. This is all the logic that we needed to define. Now, even though this intersection observer takes second parameter as well, which is optional one, so we are not providing the second parameter for the time being, and see how this logic is played out in the browser with the default settings. Okay, so let's refresh. This is page 1, page 2, page 3. Once more, page 1, page 2, page 3. Okay, so this is working just fine. That means we don't need to provide the second parameter, which is optional anyway. Now, even though we are done with the logic, however, we can define some refactoring for these two lines of code. So we have two if statements over here. We can redefine logic in a single statement by following line of code. So the code is entry.target.classList. Now just use the toggle method visible, and to this pass second parameter, which is entry dot is intersecting. So now if this entry dot is intersecting returns true, in that case this visible class will be added to this target element. However, if it's false, then this visible class will be removed from this target element. Let's check it out in the browser once more. So this is working, but let's refresh. Page 1, this is working. Page 2, this is working. Page 3, this is also working. Once more, page 1, page 2, page 3. So this is the end of our today's tutorial. I hope you did like it. If you did, please don't forget to comment, like, subscribe and share. Thank you so much.